The scratching sounds from the other coffin started on the second hour of the journey. Elias pressed himself against the satin lining of his own casket, trying to convince himself it was just a road, just a hearse of suspension, just his imagination playing tricks in the absolute darkness. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too human. Something in the coffin beside him was trying to get out, and he was trapped in a metal box doing 90 miles per hour toward the American border with nowhere to run. 3 days earlier, the plan had seemed brilliant in its morbid simplicity. Elias had spent months searching for a way across the border that didn't involve desert crossings or river swims or pack trucks. His cousin in Los Angeles had connected him with someone who knew someone who ran a very specific operation, crossing the border in hearses, hidden in coffins, playing dead while death itself provided cover. The logic was sound. Funeral vehicles cross borders regularly, carrying Mexican nationals who died in America back home for burial. Border agents rarely searched hearses thoroughly. Respect for the dead was universal, and who wanted to open coffins without good reason? For $12,000, Elias could take a one-way trip in comfort and safety, emerging in California like a resurrection. The funeral home in Tijuana looked legitimate from the outside. Respectful signage, manicured grounds, the appropriate air of solemn dignity. Inside, the director who met him after midnight was all business. He explained the process with practiced efficiency. Elias would lie in a specially modified coffin with air holes and a release mechanism. The journey would take 6 to 8 hours. No stops, no complications. Just playing dead until reaching Los Angeles. They'd shown him the coffin, and Elias had been impressed despite his nerves. It looked real from the outside, polished wood, brass handles, every detail authentic. Inside, hidden modifications made it survivable. Tiny air holes drilled in an ornate pattern that looked decorative. A silent release latch he could operate from inside if emergency arose. Even a small water bottle and energy bars tucked into hidden compartments. Professional work for a morbid purpose. The funeral director had mentioned there might be another coffin in the hearse. They often transported multiple bodies to maximize profit on each crossing. But that coffin would contain an actual corpse, someone whose family had paid for repatriation. Elias would simply be additional cargo, silent and still. The thought of sharing the hearse with the dead had unsettled him, but $12,000 was $12,000, scraped together through 2 years of saving and family loans. The night of the crossing, everything proceeded with rehearsed precision. Elias arrived at the funeral home at 2 a.m., finding the hearse already loaded with one coffin. His own waited on a gurney that opened like a hungry mouth. The director handed him a mild sedative, optional, but recommended to help with claustrophobia and stillness. Elias declined, wanting to stay alert for his journey to new life. Climbing into the coffin felt like rehearsing his own funeral. The satin lining was softer than any bed he'd owned, a cruel irony not lost on him. The director showed him the release mechanism one more time, had him practice operating it. Then came the moment of truth, the lid closing, sealing him in darkness so complete it had weight. The first minutes were the worst. Every instinct screamed to push open the lid, to escape the box that felt suddenly smaller than its dimensions. But Elias forced himself to breathe slowly through the hidden air holes, to focus on the prize waiting in Los Angeles. A construction job with his cousin's company, real wages, the chance to bring his family over legally someday, were the few hours of discomfort. The hearse started moving, and Elias felt the other coffin slide slightly, just inches from his own. He tried not to think about who lay inside, what story had ended with his final journey home. The engine's rumble was oddly soothing, and the movement helped distract from the claustrophobia. He began counting miles in his head, imagining the distance to freedom shrinking with each passing minute. The border crossing itself was anticlimactic. The hearse slowed, stopped. Muffled voices exchanged papers. A dog barked somewhere nearby, drug sniffing. Elias realized with a spike of panic. But the funeral home had assured him the coffins were sealed against scent. The dog moved on. More muffled conversation, then movement again. They were through. He was in America. Technically. Dead, but in America. That's when the scratching started. At first, Elias convinced himself it was nothing. The road was rough. Vibrations could make strange sounds. But the scratching had a pattern, a desperate rhythm that spoke of consciousness rather than coincidence. It was coming from the other coffin, steady and insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Like someone trying to claw their way out. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Maybe the body had shifted, fingernails dragging against satin. Maybe it was mice that had somehow gotten into the hearse. Maybe the sedative he'd refused would have prevented him from imagining things in the darkness. But his heart knew better. Those scratches were deliberate. Someone else was alive in the hearse. He wanted to call out, to confirm he wasn't alone in this bizarre journey. But the director had been explicit. Absolute silence until the hearse stopped in Los Angeles. Any sound could attract attention at checkpoints, gas stations, anywhere law enforcement might be listening. So Elias lay still, listening to the scratching that seemed to grow more frantic with each mile. Hours passed in darkness, punctuated by that terrible sound. Elias tried to track their progress by the feel of the road. Smooth highways giving way to city streets with more stops and turns. The other coffin's occupant had periods of silence, then renewed scratching with desperate energy. Were they running out of air? Was their release mechanism broken? The questions tortured Elias as much as his own confinement. Then, somewhere in what Elias guessed was a California desert, the hearse pulled over. Not the smooth deceleration of a planned stop, but a sudden veer to the roadside. Voices outside, agitated and arguing. The driver's door slammed. Footsteps circled the vehicle. Elias held his breath, finger on his release latch, ready to emerge if discovered. The back doors of the hearse opened. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, visible as thin lines through his air holes. Someone was examining the coffins. The scratching from the other box had stopped entirely. Voices argued in Spanish. Something about the manifest, about numbers not matching, about calling someone for instructions. One of the men wanted to open the coffins. Another argued against it. Bad luck. Disrespectful. What if they were stopped again and couldn't explain broken seals? The argument continued while Elias lay frozen, knowing that discovery meant deportation at best, federal prison at worst. His finger trembled on the release latch, ready to try running if they opened his lid. Finally, a decision. The hearse doors slammed shut. But instead of continuing toward Los Angeles, the vehicle turned around. They were going back the way they'd come, and the scratching from the other coffin had been replaced by silence. Whatever had been making that sound had given up, or worse. The hearse drove for another hour before stopping again. This time, Elias heard the unmistakable sound of the other coffin being removed. Grunts of effort, wheels rolling on pavement, a van or truck door sliding open. They were taking the other coffin somewhere, leaving Elias alone in the hearse. The scratching might have stopped, but his mind filled the silence with worse possibilities. When movement resumed, the hearse felt different. Lighter, faster, like the driver was now in a hurry. They drove for what felt like hours more, the road smooth and straight. Elias had lost all sense of direction or time. His water was gone, his body cramping from stillness, his mind fracturing from sensory deprivation and fear. The final stop came without warning. The hearse parked, engine dying into silence. Footsteps approached the back. The doors opened. This time, when the flashlight hit his coffin, Elias didn't wait. He hit the release latch and pushed, emerging into blazing daylight, like a vampire fleeing its crypt. He wasn't in Los Angeles. The landscape was all wrong. Desert scrub and distant mountains, a gas station that looked abandoned. The driver stepped back, hand moving toward a weapon. But he wasn't the funeral director from Tijuana. This was someone else, someone harder, someone who looked at Elias like cargo that had become a problem. The man explained in rapid Spanish. The other coffin had contained drugs, not a body. The scratching had been the courier, alive but not supposed to be. Something gone wrong with their sedation. Border Patrol had been tipped off. We're looking for a hearse with 2 coffins. So they dumped the drug coffin and its occupant somewhere in the desert. And now, they needed to dump Elias too. $12,000 had bought him not passage to Los Angeles, but abandonment in the California desert, with $20 the driver threw at him out of either pity or contempt. The hearse drove away, leaving Elias standing at a crossroads in nowhere, technically in America, but farther from his destination than when he'd started. He walked for hours before finding a road with actual traffic. A truck driver, suspicious but sympathetic, gave him a ride to the nearest town. From there, it was a series of bus rides, each paid for with money wired by his cousin, each mile a reminder of how wrong the plan had gone. The cousin was furious. $12,000 gone, Elias traumatized, and still legal with no papers to show for the ordeal. The full truth emerged slowly through immigrant networks. The funeral home ran a double operation, legitimate repatriations mixed with drug smuggling and human trafficking. The coffins were real because sometimes the bodies were real. Sometimes they carried drugs. Sometimes they carried people. The beauty of the system was its flexibility and the perfect cover death provided. Elias learned he'd been lucky. Others who'd used the service had different stories. Some emerged from coffins to find themselves not in California, but in stash houses, held for additional ransom. Some were abandoned in the desert when operations went bad. Some were never heard from again, and their families were left wondering if they died in those coffins or after. The scratching haunted him. In quiet moments, he still heard it, that desperate rhythm of someone trapped and afraid. Had it really been a drug courier? Or had it been another migrant? Sold the same story. Sealed in a coffin that didn't have Elias's emergency release? The not knowing was its own torture. Somewhere in the California desert was either a drug shipment or a person, abandoned because their scratching had threatened the operation. Work, when he finally found it, was in agriculture rather than construction. The cousin, still angry about the money, had withdrawn his job offer. So Elias picked strawberries, grapes, whatever was in season. The pay was less than promised, the conditions harder. But it was still better than the coffin, better than the alternative futures that journey could have delivered. He met others with crossing stories at the labor camps. Desert crossings, river swimmers, truck survivors. But none had traveled with the dead, or the supposedly dead. His story of the hearse and the scratching coffin earned him a strange notoriety. Some didn't believe it. Others nodded knowingly. They'd heard of the funeral home operation, knew people who disappeared trying it. The nightmares were specific and relentless. Not just the darkness of his own coffin, but imagining the other one who had been inside. What had they felt when the scratching brought no help? Where had the hearse stopped in the desert? And what had happened to its cargo? In dreams, Elias opened that other coffin to find sometimes drugs, sometimes a person, sometimes himself looking back with dead eyes. Years passed, but the debt remained. $12,000 at Mexican interest rates grew rather than shrank. His family had borrowed from dangerous people for his crossing, and those people didn't care that the journey had failed. Every dollar Elias earned was split between survival and servicing debt that felt as confining as the coffin had been. He never reported the funeral home. To whom? With what proof? He'd been engaged in illegal activity, had no documentation, no evidence except trauma. The funeral home probably continued operating, loading hearses with their mixed cargo of the dead and desperate. The border had many cruel economies, and this was just one more. Sometimes, driving past cemeteries, Elias would see hearses and wonder about their cargo. Were they carrying grief back home, or hope toward uncertain futures? Were the coffins filled with the dead, or the living pretending? The vehicles looked so dignified, so above suspicion, perfect covers for whatever darkness they contained. He thought often about that moment when the lid closed, sealing him in. The director had been so professional, so matter-of-fact about the process. Just another day at work, loading human cargo alongside actual corpses. The modifications to the coffin showed experience, repetition, a business model refined over time. How many had made that journey? How many had heard scratching from neighboring boxes? The $20 the driver had thrown at him still sat in his wallet years later. He couldn't spend it, couldn't throw it away. It was all he had to show for $12,000 and the worst night of his life. Sometimes he looked at it and wondered about exchange rates. Not between currencies, but between hope and horror, between plans and their execution. His cousin eventually forgave him, even helped him get better work. But the relationship was forever changed by those lost thousands and the absurdity of the attempt. Who pays to be shipped in a coffin? Who trusts death to deliver life? The questions had no good answers, only the stubborn arithmetic of desperation that made such choices seem reasonable. The scratching never left him. In quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, he heard it still, that desperate rhythm from the other coffin, message in a code he couldn't crack. Had they been trying to communicate? Warning him? Begging for help? The sounds had stopped somewhere in the desert, replaced by silence that was somehow worse. He met a woman eventually, another migrant who understood without judgment, but he couldn't tell her the whole truth about his crossing. The coffin, yes. The fear, yes. But not the scratching, not the abandonment of that other box, not the possibility that someone had died because their sedation had worn off at the wrong time. Some guilts were too specific to share. The funeral home, he heard, was eventually shut down, not for human trafficking, but for tax evasion, the American crime that succeeded where human rights violations had failed. The director was deported. The hearses were sold at auction. The modified coffins ended up who knows where. But similar operations sprang up immediately, death remaining too perfect to cover to abandon. Elias became American in all the ways that mattered except the one that counted. He learned English, paid taxes, built a life. But without papers, he remained as trapped as he'd been in that coffin, just in a larger box. The scratching from the other coffin had warned him. Perhaps some crossings extracted prices beyond money, and some journeys left you forever traveling even after arrival. His story ended not with resolution, but with continuation. Working, sending money home, servicing debt, and remembering. The hearse had delivered him to America as promised, just not in the way intended. He'd paid to play dead and learned that some performances demanded more commitment than anticipated. Somewhere in the California desert, whatever had been in that other coffin remained, its scratching forever silenced. And Elias carried the sound of those desperate attempts at communication, reminder that even in death's mockery, some things insisted on being heard, even if too late, even if to no avail, even if the only witness was another person pretending to be dead in a box 6 feet away from salvation or doom.